I met Ed Ray when I was the director of the Government Relations Office at OSU, and I had the privilege of driving him from Corvallis to Medford, up to Astoria, over to Pendleton, all the way over to Ontario. There were some downsides of driving with Ed. He thought he was a funny guy and would sometimes, when I wasn't paying attention, reach over and hit the seat heater button on my car because that was funny. He would bring a CD to put into my car, a couple, and they were John Denver CDs, and that privilege stopped after the first drive. I was not going to listen to John Denver, and so I put a stop to that. One trip with John Denver was enough. Every trip we drove on, he would rank my driving in terms of how I did. Going to some of these places, there were always wrong turns. He was, of course, totally unreliable for looking at a map or following our progress on his phone. It was all up to me as a driver to navigate us, and I would get rated when we got back to Kerr. And I think there was one time when I got a gold star for no wrong turns and no problems from Ed. He was a boss, but he was a friend. We always talked about our families as we drove, his kids, my kids, our wives, our dogs, and there was never a time when I didn't look forward to getting into the car and driving with Ed. It was dangerous working for Ed in the summer because he had a garden, and he would bring in these huge zucchinis, and it got for me that I would leave my office and lock the door to my office, because if I did not do that, I would come back and there would be 2 or 3 zucchinis on my conference table. I hate zucchinis. I've never liked them. And he knew my position on zucchinis, and if I didn't have my door locked, there were zucchinis for me when I got back. I gave Ed a birthday message when he turned 64. I called him up and I sang him Would He Still Love Me when I'm 64. I sang him that, and now that he's 80 is, for him, just a beginning. I know he's going to have many, many more birthdays, and I wish him the best. Happy birthday, Ed.
Do you remember the first time you met Ed in person?
Yeah, I remember, I was a brand new president at Ohio State, and Ed was the chair of the Department of Economics at Ohio State. And I had hired a guy by the name of Dick Sisson, wonderful man, but he and I were just exactly alike. We were hell fellows, well man, didn't know a darn thing about running a university, and we needed to have someone come in who actually knew something about finances, about the economics of higher education, a variety of other things. And Dick Sisson told me, well, there's this guy by the name of Ed Ray, and I didn't know Ed at all. Brought him in and we talked, and I immediately knew that this guy was smarter than hell. I also knew that he was not going to let me get away with any damn thing. And I'd go in and say, Ed, I'd really like to do this today. You can't do it. I mean, hell, I was the president of the university, but Ed would tell me no, and I would cower away and say, oh, okay, as I guess that Ed knows what he's doing. So after Ed came in, the train started to run on time. You know, Ed was very, very direct. He has a very good sense of humor, I know that, but it was not on display then. It used to scare the heck out of us and make certain that we towed the line. And the only thing about it was Ed was always right and I was generally wrong, so that made our relationship very keen because I listened to him. And I discovered that from my relationship with Ed that I always needed to have an Ed Ray in my life. Otherwise, the train would go off the tracks and I'd end up wearing an orange jumpsuit somewhere. The other funny memory is the fact that his wife, Beth, who was fabulous, she would give him a good left hook all the time. And she would raspberry him. And whenever I talked with her, she gave me a good laugh because I couldn't get anything out of him. He cares. Oh my gosh, what a guy. He cares. He cares about his family. He cares about the universities he serves. He cares about higher education. That's Ed. Ed, C-A-R-E, doesn't spell Ed, but it is pretty close to it.
My name is Lucas Colance, and I am a physics grad student here at Oregon State University. I received the Beth Ray ARCS Award, which was an award that Ed set up in his wife's name. I know that she was heavily involved in ARCS. She was a member, and they both thought very highly of the organization. When I accepted the reward, they put me in contact with him. I was a little intimidated, like looking him up. He's got a Wikipedia page. And so I was a little nervous when we were first gonna meet for lunch, and I'm thinking, I need to figure out what I should call this guy, because the successful guy, I probably should be like Professor Ray or Dr. Ray. So I asked him, I was like, what do you want me to call you? And he's like, I was born Ed and I'll die Ed. Okay, point taken. It's Ed. When we go to lunch, we go to McMenamin's on Monroe. That's his place. Ed likes to talk about kind of the big questions, so things like the Big Bang and religion. And what was really kind of neat about that is that he acknowledged my take on these things. I really admire how humble Ed is. Like I said, he's got a Wikipedia page, but you wouldn't know that just talking to him. He's a very down-to-earth guy. He knows that he doesn't have all the answers to any of these questions, and he's willing to listen to what other people have to say. And I think that's probably what makes him such a effective leader. You don't need to tell me that Ed cares about students. I definitely feel that. He doesn't have to do these awards and help people out like that, but he does because he cares. He sponsors scholarships like I've got, but he's also a big sponsor of the arts and sports. And I think that that's really gonna carry his legacy into the future.
My mother grew up on a farm in Prairieton, Indiana, so they had plenty of animals around growing up. But since my father was from Jamaica, Queens, in New York, there were no animals in his household. And my father was very against us having any animals. No animals, we're not gonna get any pets. And we figured out very quickly that all you had to do was get the animal and wait for Dad to come home from work. When he came home from work, if you presented the baby animal to him, he would just immediately fall in love with it. So eventually we ended up with 3 dogs, 5 cats, a cockatiel, which is a big yellow bird that would sit on my dad's head or shoulder and he would feed it Cheerios, a koi fish in a giant aquarium that he would hand feed trout food to, 2 parakeets, some gerbils, and a ball python snake. It was common almost every evening to catch him sitting in his chair with one of the dogs on his lap, a bird on his shoulder, if not on his head. Every year my mom would make my dad's favorite cake for his birthday. It was a traditional recipe that I believe came from her grandmother, which was a red velvet cake with buttercream icing. So it was a very decadent yet delicious cake, but it was incredibly rich. I mean, a piece of this cake would you could survive for 3 days in the forest. Because it was so good, it became an issue as us kids grew older, because we figured out really quickly that if you get up the next morning after Dad's birthday and no one's really paying attention, you can have cake for breakfast too. So the cake would only last about 24 hours, and then it would be completely gone. Whereas when we were very young, he'd have this cake for several days. So she started just making 2. I did learn one of the most important lessons that I learned from my father that I've been able to carry with me is that there are so few things that you can control in your life, and one thing you can control is whether or not regretting not having that extra piece of triple chocolate devil's food cake with chocolate icing. So since that's one thing you can prevent from happening, that's a regret none of us should have. Go ahead and have the extra piece of double chocolate devil's food cake with chocolate icing, because it's good.